let us turn to some issues in Heideggerian studies, stating the title as though it were an academic discipline. So I think Richard Capobianco is doing some of the best work in this field now. We have also Thomas Sheenan, who's a friend of his, doing very good work. I'm going to make an extensive notes to this video, which will give some links to Capobianco and to what I'm going to give, try to treat as a medium to just stimulate some thoughts in this, which are some things that he has brought out in a lecture. So I think with great vigor he's been pursuing the subtle nuances that one wants in Heidegger. And so he's especially said that he and Sheenan have, along with some others, have set themselves off against Dryfus and many others, Hubert Dryfus, who focuses more on a kind of phenomenological Heidegger. So Heidegger, as the way he expresses it, is by saying they take one line in Being in Time, where Heidegger, in a way, genuinely slips, because Heidegger says it's always this danger of slipping back into ontic thinking, or not having being in our care, our sorga. And Heidegger says something to the effect that makes it sound like Dasein and Delichtung, or delighting, which we give some definition by setting off, or by pronouncing in the way Giorgio Agamben pronounces. He pronounces it in this negative sense of saying Deleuze and Guattari are still, they have a subject. So there's some subject, or something that's set off against reality. And then you can go into this Lukács, or this Marxist field, where you pretend that every position except yourself, your own, is subject to this so-called ideological distortion, or false consciousness, as it's better known. Some halfway house, Zizek's like in a halfway house, where he knows about that concern, but then he says, well, I'm still going to bet on this more Lukács side, or this more, who's the guy Zizek likes, Althusser, Louis Althusser. Which, okay, can't necessarily feel an invincible repugnance towards that view, because it has some kind of steadfast resolution in it. So these kind of positions, in a way, invie with the Heideggerian position at its most unalloyed, as it were, which seems to be what is presented by, there's some German-speaking scholars, I think actually one of them is Italian Heideggerian, who are as good, if not better, as Sheenan and the guy we're looking at now, this Capobianco. But in any case, there does seem to be a big schism between those who are trying to go directly to the thought of being, as he gives one beautiful example of this. He says his teacher, William Richardson, the philosopher, who, by the way, has some videos, I think, on YouTube, says when he visited Heidegger, I think in the late 50s, he had an experience some others had had with Heidegger, that Heidegger meditating on the forest scene that he saw outside the window, gazing out of the window, said, how can I say it again, say it again, as it were, how can I slip up and say it again? And the two ways, at least two ways we know that he slipped up and said what he shouldn't say, is »ἐναργεῖς and Lichtung, which are both, again, remember, Agamben has said, not subject as in Deleuze, or in Zizek, with Zizek's focus on ideology, makes him seem to be a bit like this Deleuze-Guattari, or like the classical Lukács position, sort of, I admit we're lost, I admit we have to admit that we too might be producing a prejudice, and as Nietzsche calls it, and an ideology, as Marx calls it, false consciousness. But nonetheless, we're going to bet on our side, make a wager on our side, which presupposes that there's a reality that we're trying to hone into, and a subject which is more or less ideologically distorted, right? So the »ἐναργεῖς, or the Lichtung, as Agamben is saying, is we can distinguish from those kind of positions. They're not claiming there's a sort of a best way of seeing things, Aristotle's way of seeing things, as in the word aristocrat, which gets us in so much trouble just, I'd say de facto historically, because it means both something along the lines of meritocrat, and at the same time, de facto, the people that are in the position to be the most glittering and thought to be the best. So that there's something that it's almost as if the fact that we're a little bit confused about that brings us even further away from being genuinely perplexed by it and raising it in the city square directly as a question which asks, what do we mean by this term? Just as the term that comes closest to doing that, I would say, would be freedom, because people can see there's a difference between economic freedom, social freedom, and maybe some kinds of civil or political freedom. It becomes evident that there's at least some ways to carve up that problem of what are people revolting against the tyrant for, when they all say we're for freedom from the tyrant. In parentheses, we shouldn't forget that this word tyrannus, or how is it? Tyrannus, I guess. Tyrannus. The Y would be pronounced more like a U in ancient Greek. This word comes in exactly when we become a monetary society. So exactly where, instead of something like the settlement you would have had in Mycenae, where you had a total ruler, which is both the military ruler and the as it were the one who has the first cult of the ancestors, the first cult of the hearth, which all the others can in some way be in the light of. Once, instead of a figure like that, you have somebody who's works on the basis of money, then you have this nomos regime, this so-called convention or regime. Money and words are supposed to go together in this sense. Then you get the lawyers start to play a bigger role. That's when the word Tyrannus originates, and then you can see how in Strauss we see explicated how a tyrant in the full sense is simply somebody that most people hate. So like, but in any case, there's many examples of that, including examples that, especially that Plato plays on in his Politeia, where he's talking about the guardians, because he knows that somebody who has a position that's like a tyrannical position, like Socrates is taking, will be hated. And there was somebody, Pisistratus, who a couple generations before Plato had these bodyguards who were foreign bodyguards, like the, with the Romans, the Praetorians, paid mercenaries. So we have this deep in the tradition, that idea that mercenary is somehow meaning that you're only doing it to get something out of it, and that there's supposedly something to be guilty about in such a situation. That is very ambiguous, because you can't tell, is it because of the empirics of it, as it were, because we have the systematic evidence from Historia or investigation. We've collected evidence along the lines of what a tyrant is and what a mercenary is, and that they go together, and that this is bad, etc., etc., and that then you can see it somehow out of the facts? Or is it because seen the other way, it just accidentally happened that these discussions were happening and sensibilities were a certain way, and a discussion about those issues came down to us, and so on. There would be different ways to evaluate that, but taken from amidst these and other little excursuses, little Heideggerian ski runs through the mountains of his native lands. We come across this notion of ẽnαργεῖs. So Heidegger says the origin of this kind of, I think what Heidegger wants to say is the origin just of this thought is due to juxtaposition. So it's say people, if you live way out in a small sort of hamlet, such that there's not even that people go there to rusticate, as it were, because they don't even know about it. It's sort of way out in the hinterland, and then you juxtapose it to something else like Berlin. It creates a heightened awareness, which is like a kind of ~ἐναργεῖς, I think. Perhaps something like that is what Heidegger has in mind. So, for instance, that's why he's talking, I think in a certain way, that's what he's talking about in the little letter where he's saying why I remain in the provinces instead of accepting the call to Berlin. If we try to get back, at the same time, it's interesting. Richard Capobianco says one example of ~ἐναργεῖς would simply be the quiet realization that a tree has blossomed. So it's like sometimes you come across a magnolia tree, like a large tree, or even better, I think, rhododendron, like it's more subtle. you come across a rhododendron and it's blossomed, and so this is a velton. Is old. Apparently, there's an old form of the word velton, which didn't mean worlds, as it might be. I think it means now, but velton as the full form of the verb, the two form of the two world velton, and two world meant to sort of populate, to Großzügigkeit, to lavishly appoint things to a space or a domain, and to worldize it. So it's no longer desert, it's no longer langweilig, but it has this content which can be sick or ecstatic flesh within, which can intoxicate, and which can also have a everydayness. In connection to this, by the way, I think of how far we have lost the original meaning of something like saying Merry Christmas. Auf Deutsch, you got a statement that says something like glad holy nights. And this, I think, it points us to what you can see in, also, I don't make a general thing that all quote-unquote religions are the same, but I think because Christianity is basically a form of Judaism, because it's originally Messianism for the first 100 years or whatever, like, in other words, the claim of Paul, who was Saul, a Jew, a Roman Jew, who's to say that the Messiah has come, Messianism, and to bring over the Jewish idea of guilt and lay it over the different form with which the Greeks gave to ethics, or the feeling of that one should or should not do this. That's a very complex subject matter. Heidegger says Socrates is the greatest paragon of the Western thinking, and Nietzsche says Socrates is the first one to bring in guilt, basically. So, but the Socratic guilt isn't the same as the guilt of Jerusalem. I don't think it's not the same thing. It's not the question of the best thing to do is to, as it were, ask for forgiveness, ask for to fall down and what's the right way to the idea of Yom Kippur is sort of almost the same as Martin Luther saying Leiden, Leiden, Kreuz, Kreuz, suffering, suffering, the cross, all that we should do is express the knowledge of our own shortcomings, as it were, ask for some kind of forgiveness that we have somehow been born sinful or whatever. At the same time, this whirling of the on Yom Kippur, this idea of the young maidens twirling and dancing in the meadows, and the celebration which is associated with the leaving off of the bodily things and only moving towards Gen Eden, or the holy Eden, or the next life, or Yashem, or but whose name is actually said on that day, so Yahweh. So this opening up to the how do they also call it? Is Olam, the next world, Olam Haba. So this can be somehow all these things, the remembrance of this time seem to come together in some way. So then, of course, we have to discriminate and see if this is merely the throwing together of things that are unalike. So in this way, as we go towards the Sheenen, the specific moment sorry, not the Sheenen thing, but the Richard Capobianco, as we go towards that, we should think of, ask the question whether when we go further back towards the sort of illiterate time or the pre-literate time, or towards the archaic period, which is almost the same. The classical period is almost identical to the literate period. And then you have a pre-literate period, which, however, contains these epics which were memorized by rhapsodes who were illiterate, such as the Odyssey, such as the Mahabharata, and which were, of course, later written down. But these song traditions then kind of span the narrative across from the sort of Russian pre-literate and as it were archaic period, and the so-called classical and literate and as it were classically enlightened period. Interesting that Socrates can be kind of split in half. So you can have half of Socrates is from the earlier period, half from the so-called theoretical period, where the third eye comes in and sees itself. So this is very complex, but we get it in a very beautiful form in Heidegger saying that we can look at this word ἐναργεῖς as it appears in Odysseus, as it appears in the Odyssey, and then we can look at it as the Romans use that to mean something like evidentia, or evidence, the shining forth, which seems to be in the original word connected to any kind of speedy movement which kind of glitters like silver. And then later on, that word becomes energy at its most unalloyed in the photon. The photon is supposed to be the pure form of energy rather than mass. So you have a sketch of the movement of Western thinking over 2,600 years, but then suddenly leaping back into the rhapsodic pre-literate Odyssey, where the word has this older meaning, and then so it's a very interesting question whether the subterranean strata of the pre-literate Odyssey, when the question wasn't put in this direct way that Socrates put things, and it wasn't put under the saying of several rules of dialogic interchange, such as that you have to remember what you said, which is almost the same as the formal rule of identity, and that you can't say something different, which is almost the same as the rule of contradiction. What the lecture I'm pointing to highlights is that this is one of the breaking points with Husserl. So we see also in this lecture a very exacting account of the difference between Husserl and Heidegger. A question about that ἐναργεῖς is it like a Russian doll where there's something kind of packed within, something packed within, something packed within, so that we have to kind of look through our notion of energy, which is, we think of whatever we think of that word, hippies maybe, energy, Einstein, energy, and then we have to sort of move backwards already within the Russian doll into different stages, and so we're kind of blocked from getting to the most remote stages and actually reading it as myth, right? that you can say, is myth a good thing or a bad thing, right? With those. Depends on how we weigh it. Or you could sort of say maybe we have direct access to all these ideas directly, otherwise we have this problem of representation and whether all these Wittgensteinian problems of whether right now I can be representing something to myself, which then later when I see it is that I've encountered the thing itself, or as I encountered, or how does my representation fit into that? How did it already somehow stand in for the thing? And questions which are even difficult to comprehend the horizon out of which they're asked, and seem to be straightforwardly clear. Okay, so again in the notes I'm going to put some good information and a link to the lecture that I'm trying to use as a medium for these irradiations, as it were, or elucidations.